I will get started in about 2 minutes. Good morning. We'll get started in a minute or so. Great. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. My name is Eric Daly. Thanks for attending Multnomah Group's webinar on the top 5 retirement plan resolutions of 2018 and how to accomplish them. A few housekeeping items. First, thanks so much to so many of you for attending. We had previously scheduled this for last week, had some technology issues that prevented us from presenting, so appreciate obviously so many of you creating time today to go through this topic with us. A couple other housekeeping items. The lines have been muted so that hopefully the sound quality will be better. That said, we certainly always are interested in feedback throughout the presentation and at the conclusion. So to the extent that you have questions that may pop up during today's presentation, do feel free to log those in using the GoToWebinar tool on the right-hand side, and we'll either address them in the meat of the presentation or at the conclusion, or 3, if it's a question that requires a little bit more research, be happy to follow up with you directly. Second housekeeping item, we will be recording today's presentation, so barring me saying any silly things, we'll have that available for viewing at a later date if you choose to, and available on the website. And we will be distributing a copy of the slides. So if you have an interest there, we'd be happy to ensure that everybody who's on today's webinar, plus those who had previously registered but could not attend today, get a copy of those materials as well. At the start of the year, you always feel compelled to some degree or another to take a look at what your priorities are and what you're trying to accomplish on a personal basis. So there was a number of different studies, reports, and reviews out there that took a look at the most common resolutions for 2018. I particularly like the ones from YouGov, which were 1, eat healthier. I think I certainly would have the goal of eating healthier than I have been over the course of the holidays. 2, get more exercise. 3, save more money. 4, get more sleep. And 5, read more. All certainly admirable objectives. I thought it'd be interesting maybe to wind the clock back a decade and see if they're significantly different than the resolutions we had in 2008. And really they weren't, right? We wanted to save more. Here we wanted to lose weight. I think it's more acceptable to say eat healthier now than lose weight. We want to get more exercise, we want to get organized, and we want to develop a new skill or talent. And not surprisingly, as I look back over the decades, the resolutions don't change much. Maybe the verbiage that we use changes, but the objectives that we as people seem to have don't modify or change significantly. And I would argue that maybe one of the reasons is that we don't always accomplish the objectives that we lay out during this resolution period. I thought it was also interesting, just from a financial markets perspective, to take a look at the differences between 2008 and 2018. We were flying off the October 2007 S&P high that walked us into what began the Great Recession, really, of 2008, which started arguably back on March the 17th with the Bear Stearns catastrophe and the impact on markets. I also thought it was interesting that, frankly, the objectives and resolutions that we have for ourselves aren't significantly different than what we, as consultants, hear from our clients related to their objectives for the retirement plan. All of our clients want to be more organized. They want to spend less on services. They want their participants to save more. They want, as a committee, as an organization, to learn new things and become more empowered and more successful. And ultimately, they want to see their plan and their participants get healthier. Not different than really what my objectives were and so many Americans were at the start of this particular year. So in looking at those objectives, I thought it'd be kind of interesting to take a look back at 2008 to 2018, compare those objectives, why perhaps they didn't work for you as plan sponsors in 2008, and how you can make sure they work for you in 2018. And let's start with getting organized, because ultimately I think every effective retirement committee and every effective plan sponsor needs some level of organization. And I look back to what our clients were doing, 10 years ago to try and get themselves more organized. They had these wonderful 3-ring binder administration manuals that had been put together by their providers that talked about what to do when you add a participant and change a user and take a distribution. And maybe your plan document was stapled in there, and maybe your investment policy statement was in there. We were all obsessed with making sure we filed our enrollment and beneficiary forms, and so many clients were doing weekly calls with the plan record keeper to try and keep up on the administrative obligations that having a retirement plan, a defined contribution plan, brings. Ultimately, those things had pretty limited success, right? Most of the binders that we had are now long since gone and lost, and frankly, the systems have been updated by our providers 3 and 4 times, certainly over the decade, in some cases over any given year. So the need for those kind of documents is diminished. Almost all of administrative outsourcing for larger plans has become web-based, and therefore the notion of filing documents or beneficiary forms to provide for auditors has become less effective than using the online tools and tracking that are available out there. So if we look at what we're encouraging our clients to do in 2018, it's being realistic about how retirement plans operate. Realistically, I think that for anybody who's worked with a retirement plan long enough, we have to acknowledge that mistakes are going to occur. We have these very complicated plan documents, difficult rules, and periodically, whether it's the record keeper, the plan administrator, or the payroll contact, or the CFO, or the controller, or the HR director, there's going to be mistakes in the administration of these complex plans. What we think clients need to do is really determine where the likelihood of risks is high and the impact is the greatest. So where do we have holes in our operating system, and where, if we don't monitor those holes correctly, could we have a negative impact or a significant negative impact on the plan? And then develop a plan to address those risks and make sure that we're tracking it on a recurring and scheduled basis. This is a more realistic, not a we never are going to make a mistake, certainly don't have the objective of making mistakes, but being realistic about the possibility of those things occurring, I think makes the most sense. So if you look at, where are the most likely areas for plans to be in trouble, we looked at it from 2 different perspectives. One, the Internal Revenue Service, right? From a tax perspective, when the IRS comes to your door What are they most likely to focus on, and where do they most find the highest frequency of failures? Certainly, the most important is failure to amend the plan document for tax law changes. We've been through a recent restatement of defined contribution plans tying in what have been several years of various amendments made due to tax law changes. It's amazing how frequently plan sponsors don't amend or update their plans based on those tax law changes. From an operations perspective, clearly the failure to follow the plan's definition of compensation for calculating whether it's deferral contributions, matching contributions, or other sources of contributions is significantly material. Frequently, for those of us who work in benefits, new compensation categories are being created regularly with very little thought, frankly, to what impact they might have on the actual definition of compensation in the plan document. Being able to tie together those compensation definitions with the categories that are being created by business managers outside the retirement plan universe is critical. The failure to include eligible employees in the plan or failure to exclude ineligible employees to the plan. Having an understanding of what types of participants, be it hours or job classifications, are eligible to participate in our plans and ensuring that they're in, but also not allowing those who shouldn't be receiving contributions to benefit under the terms of the plan, both of which are far too common because during a recruiting process, again, benefits not being included in that discussion, promises are made about eligibility, whether or not those can be met based on the current eligibility definitions in the plan document. Certainly, we've continued to hear and we've written about these failure to satisfy plan loan provisions, failure to take money out of paychecks to repay loans, do it on a timely basis. All of those are creating a mass amount of failures, and we're seeing movement away from the current loan systems to more efficient loan systems to reduce that, and then impermissible in-service withdrawals, probably most common hardship withdrawals that weren't permissible. We combine that with where are you most likely to be sued by a class action firm based on the dissatisfaction of your participants. And from our perspective, there's really 10. We continue to see class action in the 403B marketplace related to multiple record keepers who are charging for duplicative work. In both the for-profit and tax-exempt markets, revenue sharing arrangements that resulted in excessive fees. We'll talk a little bit about not having an open competitive bidding process for record keepers that you can document as a plan fiduciary. We'll talk about fee structures that have resulted in a large retirement plan subsidizing other smaller executive benefit plans or services, which is impermissible. We'll talk about investment options that may have severe restrictions on liquidity. We'll talk about having too many investment options and the perceived challenge that they may have in helping participants understand the investment menu, which really ties into this notion of duplicative investment options, where investment options that have a very similar objective have significantly different cost structures and impacts on participants. Retail investment options and the utilization of retail investment options where less expensive institutional products are available, and the notion of using proprietary investment options when other less expensive, better performing investment alternatives from other providers may be available. And last and certainly not least is the utilization of investment options that have historically underperformed. So when you're looking at class action litigation, that continues to be the 10 primary areas of focus. Most class action cases probably have some form of 6, 7 to as many as 10 of those that are tied into a complaint document. Knowing that those are the primary, let's call those the primary 15 areas that we should be concerned about, preventing plan errors becomes critical, right? How do we develop policies and procedures and internal controls that reduce the risk of having failures in those 15 areas? We would argue that certainly having an annual fiduciary program that tracks those 15 separate items becomes a critical component in helping mitigate risk and reducing the likelihood of running afoul of any of those 15. And by having an ongoing fiduciary education program and training, it helps bring your committees up to a level of expertise where they can be more effective in helping manage the fiduciary risks of the organization. Um, that said, knowing that there's a possibility and even likelihood that within those 15 areas from year to year there may be areas of opportunity for improvement and potential failures, identifying how to correct and how to improve the process so that these errors don't recur on a continual basis. Certainly, when independent auditors come in and look at your plan on an annual basis, for those of you subject to ERISA, what they're looking for is not perfection. They're looking for the improvement of process over time. So continually fine-tuning your approach to develop it. We certainly philosophically believe with our clients that it's not reasonable to expect perfection, but we want to make sure that our clients are continually improving their processes so that they're making better decisions, having different, less important, less significant failures when they do occur. When failures occur, that they develop processes to ensure that they don't recur from year to year. So what is a fiduciary program? A fiduciary program can be many things to many different types of clients. The primary purpose is really to outline the key tasks that a committee is going to go through to monitor their fiduciary responsibilities. So this is not the binder from 2008 where we lay out the various things and how we do things, but it is a process by which we track critical things. Over what time frame will we do fee benchmarking work? At what time frame will we look at share classes? At what time frame will we and when will we look at audit reports that have been provided by our independent auditors? We want to draw in the relevant stakeholders and then be able to demonstrate through documentation reporting back up to the delegating group. So for many of you who work on retirement plan committees, a critical thing we've been working with clients on is how do we report back to those who have created the delegation for us at the retirement committee level. Because merely delegating information or delegating responsibility to a committee but not providing some level of oversight will be a difficult fiduciary prudence argument to make. Always important, as with every policy and procedure that you have on the retirement side, if you're going to adopt a process by which you manage these responsibilities, it's important that you actually follow that process, right? So having a process reduces risk. Having a process but not following it creates risk where risk need not be. So I thought I'd share our sample fiduciary program to give you a feel for what we think a complete and appropriate fiduciary delegation or fiduciary program might look like. We tend to break things into quarters. We recognize and realize that we probably only have with a committee less than 12 hours annually. So it's really important that we be efficient in scheduling out and meeting out the information so that we get the most bang out of those 12 hours as possible. Clearly, over the course of the year, we may spend dozens and dozens and dozens of hours with benefits professionals, human resource professionals, and finance professionals outside the context of a committee. But when the primary committee that has responsibility for operating the plan is assembled, we want to be really efficient about making sure that we meet all of our obligations and that we're monitoring those 15 factors that I mentioned earlier. So in the first quarter, we spent a lot of time on the fiduciary governance process, helping ensure that committees are aware of the delegation documents that are in place and that we're following those documents and that they don't need to be modified or amended to address changes either in best practice or regulation. In the second quarter, we spent a lot of time talking about fees and services. Clearly, the notion of not paying more than we need to for services is a prudent one and an area of great risk from a fiduciary perspective. So how do we monitor that in an efficient way to help plan sponsors become comfortable that they understand the fees that they're paying and that they've benchmarked those against other reasonable options that may be available in the marketplace? In the third quarter, we're spending a lot of time on engagement and disclosures. What are we doing from a participant behavior perspective? How are we attempting to provide information and the reasonable and necessary disclosures to participants in a way that they can take action on it? And in the fourth quarter, we're doing a lot of plan operations testing and compliance, taking a look at any amendments that we may have needed to make or are making at the end of the year to ensure that our plan complies with Internal Revenue Service obligations and guidelines, but also taking a look at our audit reporting and our plan testing reporting to make sure that there aren't areas of potential failure related to our Internal Revenue Service obligations as well. I think one of the things that we'll talk about over the course of today's presentation is in trying to meet these kind of 5 resolutions for retirement plans in 2018. A big part of it is planning it out ahead of time and delegating the functions out to service providers and others to make sure that the limited resources that many of our plan sponsors face aren't the primary deterrent to them meeting their obligations and certainly even meeting their objectives and goals in the coming year. So if we look at the second of those resolutions, it's clearly to spend less, right? I want to spend less on coffee drinks when I come into work every day, and I think plan sponsors, understandably from a fiduciary perspective, want to spend less of their participants' money on providing these retirement benefits. So what didn't work in 2008? Well, remember in 2008, we were in the midst of this huge market decline. Equity markets, S&P was down 40% in 2008. So trying to spend less for retirement services became relatively difficult because, frankly, retirement plan assets were dropping at such a rapid rate that it was nearly impossible to renegotiate with service providers, as service providers, many of which were challenged significantly in trying to remain viable, given how much less they were taking in revenue, because so many of them were using asset-based models to pay for record keeping, administration, and employee communication services. Clearly in 2008, I couldn't find many committees that had any interest in doing RFPs. There wasn't time and staff to support it. I think there was massive layoffs. You saw the number of job losses in 2008. There was not a lot of appetite for monitoring or changing providers, or simultaneously you had so many employers that were reducing contributions to the retirement plan. And even those that may have been in process in 2007 all of a sudden began to have significant fears about changing providers when market volatility was as high as what we experienced back in 2008. And maybe most importantly, most plan sponsors had no idea what they were paying. This is pre-Schedule C of the Form 5500. This is pre-408B2. This is pre-404A5, all the primary disclosure elements that have been so advantageous to plan sponsors and participants. So what can we do in 2018? Well, we need to become aware of what's happening in the marketplace. I just had an opportunity to talk to a reporter from Pensions and Investments magazine, and the degree of consolidation among record keepers is having a very significant impact on price contraction for record keeping and administration services. Very different than the environment in 2008. Frankly, fee transparency and disclosures have allowed plan sponsors and committees to have a much better understanding of what they are paying so that they can actually benchmark that effectively. I think the best committees are building regular benchmarking into their fiduciary program. The model I showed you has it annually. Some may have it less frequently, but having it regularly allows you to evaluate your pricing relative to the competitive marketplace. We've also seen a massive proliferation in mutual fund share classes, and the notion of committees having a better understanding of share classes and making sure that they understand what share class they're eligible for is helping reduce their fiduciary risk. And what we've also seen is that plan vendors, because of the consolidation, have had to be realistic about what other objectives they may have in servicing retirement income plans. And ultimately, you as plan sponsors knowing that will give you more information to help negotiate more effective, more transparent, and more advantageous fee arrangements with your providers. So if you want to go back to 2008, this is all that's not contained exclusively by retirement plans, but I think it's indicative of what we've seen in the retirement plan marketplace. You can see from 2007 to 2008, very difficult time for investment managers, and certainly for record keepers that were trying to address increased call volumes from participants who are obviously scared, having to address declines, significant declines in revenues because of the asset-based models they used. But we're now in 2016, mutual fund assets, retirement assets almost doubling over that course of that decade, from 2008 to 2018. And from a fee benchmarking and spending less perspective, I think for most plan sponsors, they can accomplish those objectives relatively quickly in 3 simple steps, right? One is determine how much I'm paying and to whom. Every committee should have an understanding of what their 408b2 filings say from their providers and what income they're deriving from servicing your plan. You should also understand the data that's contained in your Schedule C Form 5500, where many of the direct payments, not the indirect, but many of the direct payments out of the plan are being made. And you should understand the 404A5 participant disclosure. So while those may be prepared by your providers, they're fiduciary responsibilities of the committee. So a good committee should have a fundamental understanding of their 408b2, their 404A5, and their Schedule C, which is where they disclose, not all, but the majority of expenses paid by the plan. And then take that data and benchmark your cost to the competitive marketplace. And I think it's important to have a good and independent resource for that information. There's a lot of terrible information about fees and average costs from our perspective, and in doing numerous vendor searches every year, what the average plan sponsor pays for services tends to be significantly higher than what they could pay if they were to take that plan to a competitive marketplace. So from our perspective, comparing your plan to the competitive marketplace is the appropriate benchmark, not comparing it to the average plan sponsor, which may overpay for services because they haven't had an opportunity or taken the opportunity to rebid their plan for some period of time. Ensure your comparisons are apples to apples. We have found that certainly there are 2 factors that seem to impact pricing most dramatically. One is the number of bodies. Clearly, the more participants, the greater scale a plan has, and therefore the lower the marginal cost should be. And the second, and arguably maybe even the more important factor, is the average account balance. Because ultimately, service providers are concerned with providing services to pools of money, and the less participants tied to that money does tend to have a very significant positive impact on reducing the marginal cost. So plans with higher average account balances tend to pay significantly less than like plans with lower average account balances. Ensure your plans of like size when you're doing the benchmarking, and don't get lost in the weeds. I think ultimately, yes, if you have 8 days of education, that is marginally more expensive than having 6 days of education. But I think you can get a contextual picture without getting lost in the specifics of data format, days of education, by looking at the marketplace a little more broadly. And then once you have that comparative data, fix it. The good news is it's a very highly competitive and increasingly efficient marketplace. You can keep frequently the exact same investment menu and port it to different record keepers and administrators. So if ultimately you're not able to negotiate a favorable outcome with your current provider, you have the ability to take that plan to a different provider who provides similar services and perhaps even maintain, again, the same investment architecture that you've built over the course of years and years. I will say from a fiduciary perspective, we're continuing to see more and more pressure on plan sponsors to evaluate vendor search. When you look at the class action litigation, plans that haven't done a vendor search for a protracted period of time seem to be an area of significant focus. Ultimately, There is no fiduciary responsibility that's definitive in doing a search. So having an adequate or an appropriate fee benchmarking process pushes us in the right direction. But I do think that it helps committees have a better understanding to, over some period of time, conduct a vendor search to make sure that they have a definitive benchmark for their plan specifically. If you're going to do a vendor search, we certainly think that there are pretty significant benefits. Ultimately, we get access to information from the marketplace that would be difficult to get through any other outsourcing solution. But what ultimately plan sponsors find is that they're getting better plan sponsor and participant technology. They're getting higher savings analysis tools and more effective savings analysis tools. They're getting increased and more effective participant education. They're getting access to better and less expensive investment options. They're getting better all-around service and even more commitments from service providers to put fees at risk for meeting certain objectives that are laid out by the plan sponsor. The third piece I talked about under the spend less is understand share classes. Most menus have somewhere between 15 and maybe 25 investment options in a defined contribution plan. For those 15 to 25 investment options, it is important that you as a plan sponsor understand the share class options that are out there. We put together a sample of this is a real investment product that has, in this case, 8 different share classes of the exact same investment product, ranging from a low of 0.27% to a high of 1.44%. Clearly, when you look at the litigation, the notion of share classes has become an area of easy scrutiny and criticism. So plan sponsors who haven't looked at their share class allocation and haven't made definitive decisions about what share class to buy and why certainly expose themselves to risk. So at least for the 15 to 25 positions that you're working on regularly as part of your fiduciary program, looking at share classes and opportunities to reduce cost, thereby improving returns, is critical. Always important to point out there is no obligation that a plan sponsor use the least expensive share class available. However, if you're not using the least expensive share class available, you would want to be able to articulate the why. Why have we elected to use a more expensive investment option? And to further complicate things, for many investment strategies, certainly most investment strategies, larger plan sponsors may be able to purchase those investment strategies through a collective form, which may have even reduced cost to what a regulated mutual fund may have. So understanding both the share class, but also the opportunities and certainly the committee's position on using collective trusts as investment options in the plan becomes critical. And then last, as it relates to spending less, is really understanding the motivations of providers. Record keeping is a low margin business, and scale makes it profitable, but not high margin and generally not heavily leverageable. For most record keepers in the marketplace, they have additional objectives or motivations as to why they might be wanting to provide retirement plan administration, record keeping, and employee communication services. A big one, arguably the largest historically, has been the notion of increasing the likelihood of getting high margin investment management opportunities, proprietary funds or managed accounts at a participant level. These are areas where the profitability or the margin is much higher than you would see on the record keeping administration side. That said, as the marketplace has become more efficient, the heavy utilization of proprietary funds seems to be on the decline, and in many cases being replaced with a heavier utilization or marketing of managed accounts to participants, where a record keeper through an automated solution can get significant asset-based fees on participant accounts individually. Second is the rollover opportunities. we've been talking about over the course of the last, what feels like forever, but is more like the last 2 years, the fiduciary rule and its impact on rollovers from retirement plans. And while the fiduciary rule in many forms and fashions has become law, the evisceration of the compliance piece of it has made rollover opportunities still a pretty significant piece of provider revenue models. So ultimately, understanding providers that rely on rollovers and either growing comfortable with that rollover process or not would dictate how you feel about a provider on this side. And the last, and not least, it's pretty significant, is this notion of selling ancillary services. Through a retirement account, you have trusted access to a pool of participants. You have access to information about their age, potentially their wage, and frequently we are seeing providers as part of a larger finance entity selling ancillary services to participants. It could be insurance, it could be taxable investment products, it could be banking solutions, it could be a million other things. But having that access to information and, again, that trusted relationship does provide them the opportunity to sell ancillary services. No one or any of these necessarily is negative. However, understanding them and in many cases creating controls to ensure that they're not abused does become critical. So again, on high margin investment management opportunities, having a process by which you evaluate the appropriateness of having managed accounts in your plan, which are not required. Certainly, if you're going to use proprietary funds of your record keeper, I think you're almost under a higher obligation to demonstrate why relative to other outside products that may have been available. As it relates to rollover opportunities, how comfortable are you with the types of solutions that your provider is bringing to the marketplace, and are they accepting fiduciary responsibility for any guidance they are providing to participants related to the rollover process? And the same is true on the ancillary service side. Do you generally feel good about the products that are being brought to participants? And if not, do you need to have some form of non-solicitation agreement in place with your providers to ensure that, again, these ancillary revenue opportunities aren't creating abuses inside your retirement program? The third, save more. I want to put more money away. I've got both my own retirement and continuing education and college for my children to worry about. And I think that for most plan sponsors, the objective is to try and increase savings rates. And back in 2008, it was a rough time for increasing savings rates. What didn't work? Well, committing to our employee education program, right? We're going to do more education and explain why participants should put more money away. We're going to put up some really compelling compound interest graphs so that they can see the opportunity cost of not saving. We're going to educate participants on stocks and bonds to make them more effective and better investors. And ultimately, what we faced in 2008 was declining participation rates. We had people who were worried about their jobs. We had people who were potentially taking money out of their retirement plan to address hardship that they may have had during this recession of 2008, 2009. So what do we do in 2018 to get our plan where we want to get it? And it's fix our plan design. Fixing plan designs is tremendously effective. It works nearly every time in getting target savings rates. Use behavioral finance tools to help drive outcomes and behaviors rather than pull people through the retirement program. And then also determine how much is enough. I think to always say that we need to save more may not take into account the realities of where our employee population is depending on the design of your plan. Let's start with, how much money do you need, and as a result, how much do you need to save? We tend to look pretty carefully at the study that Marlena Lee did related to generating replacement income in retirement. And ultimately, how much you make determines what percentage of that income you're going to need to replace in retirement. So folks that are on the low income side are going to need to replace nearly every dollar that they're earning today. So in this case, you look at somebody under $26,000 a year, they're going to need to replace 82% of that income to be able to maintain their lifestyle. Conversely, if you take somebody who's making more than $85,000, they probably only need to replace about 58% of your income. Then secondarily, Social Security has a very significantly different impact on replacement rates for lower paid workers. Social Security is a security blanket that provides a much more material portion of their income back. So again, that lowest quartile of under 26,000 is getting about 60% of their income replaced by Social Security. On the other side, a participant making more than 85 is probably only getting about 20% of that back from Social Security. And as a result, even to get to a much lower 58% replacement number, the amount of money that they will need to generate through private savings is much more material, about 37%. So if you look at that, there are some, success probability statistics from that same study that we use with clients regularly. And I think identifying what level of total savings is appropriate for our plan and our design and our population based on demographics is a big piece of this. So taking a look and saying, well, does our plan, would we want it to reasonably be able to replace income, for instance, for participants earning between $60,000 and $70,000? Because frankly, for participants making more than that, the contribution rates would have to be so high as to be unrealistic. So picking a wage band and then picking a contribution level. So for instance, in the same example, participants who are making between $60,000 and $70,000 a year to have a 90% probability of generating a successful retirement would need to be putting away about 11% a year. Well, 11% is going to be a combination of both their contributions and any employer contributions. So if we had a plan that was 100% match on the first four, they would need to save 7%, receive a 4% match to get to that 11% threshold. But identifying what is our target savings rate and knowing that some portion of our population, likely the highest paid portion of our population, is going to have to do more than that to try and successfully manage their own retirement, but targeting some middle portion of our population that's appropriate based on our plan design. And once we do that, getting away from thinking that we're going to be able to encourage them to get there and instead using the automatic tools that are available to us as well as the behavioral finance tools to try and drive outcomes. If you look at the data from the America Saves study in 2017 from Vanguard, ultimately plan-weighted participation rates were about 81%. Automatic enrollment participant-weighted participation rates were about 90%. Voluntary enrollment only 63%. That's a tremendous difference between the two pieces, right? So knowing that 37% of our population, regardless of how much education we provide, may not choose to or take the necessary steps to save in a retirement plan puts us at a significant disadvantage. So looking at plans where we affect automatic enrollment and affect automatic re-enrollment to try and get us to the target savings rate. And doing those things will work almost every time. And if you do them enough times, it'll work eventually. So if you look at trying to drive those participation rates, let's go back to that target 11% savings rate for my fictitious client. We've chosen the targeted combined savings rate of 11%. We've got a match, which is 4% or 100% of the first four. Then we're going to automatically enroll everybody at the plan match level, right? So every new hire is going to come in at 4% of pay and get a 4% match. And then we're going to automatically escalate all participants until they get to the combined savings rate of 11, so 7% on the deferral side. And if we do that and then ultimately drive that over a period of time, we should get the overwhelming majority of our participants, probably well over 85%, at our target savings rate. And then if we have low turnover, then there's also the opportunity to go back and re-enroll the current population. It has become increasingly popular in 2017-16 to re-enroll participants who are either not saving or not saving at an adequate level. And the most aggressive sponsors have gone even to annual re-enrollment. So a participant can continue to annually opt out, but it certainly indicates to all participants the importance of saving within the organization. We'll talk a little bit about why you as a plan sponsor should even care about savings rates. But certainly if you're trying to drive the outcome, spending less money on communication education solutions and more money on automatic enrollment contribution formulas is going to be more effective for the overwhelming majority of plan sponsors. The next is learn more. What didn't work in 2008? Well, for all your best intentions, everybody who worked in benefits that I knew certainly had a conference budget of zero coming out of the Great Recession and a travel budget of less than zero. There also was, well, I can attend, provider webinars in my free time, but because of the, frankly, workplace contraction, there was no free time to be had. So as a result, it was really difficult to do much more than kind of hang on by your fingernails from a fiduciary training and education perspective. What to do in 2018? I think you really have to consider incorporating education into the current fiduciary program. Again, if you as a committee have 12 hours, maybe less, of direct meeting time a year, depending on your plan size, it's not realistic to expect that many of the committee members are going to be able to prioritize retirement committee education when competing with other business objectives and priorities that they have, given the types of folks that end up on these retirement committees. We've incorporated employee education, committee education into each of our meetings to help broaden that understanding of the committee members and make them more effective. Making them more effective tends to make the meetings shorter. They're better prepared to make decisions. So shortening the content to fit it into the committee meetings, focusing the content, and making sure that new committee members are oriented so that when they come in, they're not starting at zero. We can bring them up the learning curve more quickly to make them more effective and more impactful as committee members. So from a fiduciary training program, we've been developing ours for some time. We've really broken it into kind of 5 key areas and have a number of topics that we educate committees on over the course of our relationship together. Committee education, from our perspective, can't just be what's the newest thing that people are talking about, because frankly, most committee members need a tremendous amount of orientation, and for them, what was new 5 years ago is still brand new to them. So we look at governance and what do we need to help them understand about the governance process so they understand both their fiduciary duty as committee members, but also what good governance looks like. Understanding service providers and fees becomes increasingly difficult. The rate of change among service providers, models, fee models, disclosure models is very, very rapid. So trying to keep plan sponsors and committee members abreast of those changes is critically important. The employee engagement and disclosure piece. What are we required to provide participants, and how are we monitoring that, and why is it important? From a plan operations perspective, this is an area where committees tend to be really underinformed as it relates to their obligations. How do plan testing interact with your audit, interact with the IRS provisions of 404C and 404A5? And then investment education. Good committees have an understanding of at least investment basics to help them ask good questions, good critical questions about investment products and performance. So educating both on kind of the basics of investment as well as more nuanced topics of asset class coverage and target date fund selection and monitoring all help improve committees and make them more effective in their decision making and deliberation. And then last, but certainly not least is getting healthy. And I'm going to talk about getting healthy from a participant financial health and wellness perspective. So back in 2008, we were worried about explaining inflation, and of course, we went into a low inflation to no inflation environment that we've existed in the last decade. We talked about educating on sustainable withdrawal strategies. So, is the 4% withdrawal rule is going to work for participants? And frankly, that changed pretty quickly to a market that had experienced a 40% decline, and all of a sudden, sustainable withdrawal strategies was no longer an issue because nobody was retiring. And discussing the finer nuances of Roth versus, pre-tax savings. In 2018, I think financial wellness is a real opportunity, and I understand why plan sponsors are interested in it. But I think defining what the specific problem is that you're trying to solve is an important piece of trying to really get healthy and improve financial health and wellness. And then I think you have to be realistic about the employer's desired role in addressing it. All benefits appear to be beneficial, but being realistic about whether the benefits we're providing fit within the employer role and how can they be impactful to plan participants and the success of the organization. Assessing the demographics of those involved, let's take a look at our population and where does financial wellness impact them, and then determine how to best communicate with those that we ultimately want to try and make well in 2018. So for those that aren't aware, financial wellness, and I can't imagine at this point anybody isn't, because if you look at the statistics, it's pretty compelling that the rate of change is pretty significant. Ultimately, as an employer, what you're trying to do is put together a program that helps financial wellness the same way that you've been working on probably on physical wellness to try and help reduce your health and welfare costs from an insurance perspective. And what you're hoping is with that you're going to reduce absenteeism, that you're going to have employees with less stress and therefore happier and more effective in their jobs, and that ultimately that will help avoid things like delayed retirement, where you may have less effective staff and participants who are having to stay employed past their level of interest because they're not in a position where they're prepared to retire. So a consideration for you as a plan sponsor, clearly is the messaging. So how do you as a plan sponsor try and communicate to participants the importance of financial wellness and provide them the resources in a way that they're comfortable utilizing them? Many of the financial wellness solutions out there are tied to products or sales efforts, which is explaining somebody's problem so you can sell them a product by which they can fix the problem. And if you do that, I think that you should not be surprised that your participants are going to hold you accountable for monitoring the quality of products that are being brought to them. And while that may not be a fiduciary obligation, it's one that has a pretty significant impact on how participants feel about their financial wellness programs. The good news is I think that retirement service providers can be a critical piece of helping bridge that gap. I think what they've seen is a tremendous increase in the utilization of financial wellness programs. Large and mid-sized employers, 84% of them have some form of a financial wellness program, which is up 10% from the year prior. They realize that student debt is a significant inhibitor among millennials to retirement plan savings. Because their models are tied to people saving more. If they have participants who can't save because of student debt, that has an impact. And then from you as an employer, if you look at some of the data related to retirement effectiveness and whether people are on pace to be able to retire in a way that has a standard of living tied to their current standard of living, those that are without student debt are significantly more likely to be able to maintain that standard of living in retirement than those who currently do. As a result of that, retirement service providers are bringing very effective financial wellness programs to integrate with their employee communication programs. And ultimately, this is important to the effectiveness of your plan. So working with your service provider to bring in the elements that make sense, evaluating where you may need to bring in external resources to support that effort is significant, because if we look at the impact of the transition that we talk about from defined benefit to defined contribution, it's material. And the materiality really comes down to the fact that more and more participants are delaying retirement, and they're delaying it because of uncertainty about what type of retirement income a defined contribution plan can provide. And at the end of the day, while it doesn't show up in your contribution formulas, the costs of that are significant. Workers' compensation claim duration is 25% longer, and benefit payments are 56% higher for older workers. Disability premiums are 15 times higher, and disability instances are 42% higher for workers 65 and older. And delayed retirements have a significant impact on healthcare costs for those of you who just finished the renewal process. So I think ultimately the 5 objectives that are out there are achievable in 2018, but I think the moral of the story is they have to be built in to your overall program. Realistically, your committees aren't going to generate more time to work on these facets, but if they can be integrated into the 8 to 12 hours that your committees may meet a year, they can all be accomplished, and they can be accomplished relatively quickly, depending on the commitment to change within the committee organization structure that you work within. So with that, I think I'm getting really close to the 11 o'clock stop time on the West Coast, 2 on the East Coast. So I'm going to open it up to questions and give people a short period of time, if you have some questions, to type those out and see if I can address them. Well, I'm giving people a chance to type, but I'm not seeing much. So I'm going to take that to mean that all of your retirement plan resolutions are lined up and you know how to tackle them effectively for 2018. As is always the case, we're more than happy if questions may pop up after the fact to help you tackle those. Feel free to email me directly. I'm happy to answer those, or lob a call in if you've got a question that you want to get answered. Thanks so much for your time. We, as always, appreciate your participating in our webinar series. And again, feel free to share this information, both the slides and the presentation, with others within your committee as you kind of put together your fiduciary plan for 2018. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day.